Welcome to the Protection Pros podcast, brought to you by CPPS, the leading provider of workplace violence solutions. I'm your host, Stacey Brown. Join us as we explore the world of security leadership through the lens of the pros who live it. Jake Newton, cheers, my friend.
Cheers, Stace.
How you doing?
I'm doing good. Thank you
Good.
so much for having me on your wonderful show.
Thank you for being here. I appreciate that. Let's just dive right into it, shall we?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, so I'll just briefly, I know you have quite the experience that we'd like to dive into and I'd like to pick your brain about, but you have over 15 years experience in the security crisis management across both public and private sector, as well as military and all of that experience. So I'd really like to kind of have you give us an overview of how it came to be that you are COO at CPPS.
Well, you did a great job at making me sound a lot cooler than what I am.
Okay.
My career largely started with the Air Force. My first real job, believe it or not, was actually with the state of New York, working for a state park, and did general maintenance there. My first entree into the security world was helping out the park rangers with kind of maintaining the behavior of all the drunk people in the park at night.
Really?
Yes, that was pretty fun. So I did that for a couple summers. And then when I went into the Air Force, I joined a career field called SEER, and that stands for Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape. Did that for several years up until 2009 to 2014. I had the privilege of being part of that community. And then basically joined CPPS in 2014. I was medically discharged from the Air Force. I got hurt. And kind of a funny story is when I was looking to move on from the Air Force and kind of during that whole season of life, I met this girl who is now my wife, Katie. And when I was dating her and getting to know her, I met her father, Randy, and he happened to just coincidentally come from the same career field that I came from, the SEER world. And so when I was getting out, he asked me, I was like, well, do you want to join the team? We do some similar things that you did when you're, active duty and those sorts of, capabilities. And I said, yeah, that sounds great. Cause that kind of
Nice segue.
removed any headaches for me trying to find a new position. And so,
and you get to take all of that experience with you, right?
Exactly.
So it's not like you had to start
It
over.
was a
So that's
straight
great.
applicability, which was awesome.
Yeah.
And I started November 2014. It was actually, I had terminal leave time when I was coming out of the Air Force and had a month left of that. I started
Double dipping
at the company, double dip for a little while. It was really cool. And I've pretty well been with the company since. I did do a short time as like 16 or 17 months or something with a travel risk management company called On Call International. And otherwise, yeah, I've been with CPPS the entire time in the private sector and have had various roles. When I started, I basically had two hats. I did business development for the company, and my other hat was doing instructional things, which is the part of the SEER background, which we'll get into, I'm sure. And that kind of blossomed to where I grew in both roles and to where now I have made my way up to being COO. Which is in part due to Randy's passing back in November, which many probably know, but that was kind of the journey, is just making my way up through the ranks over several years. And when he passed, I was kind of positioned to take over.
Well, I would also say, as someone that has worked with you for a couple of years now and knows you, I would also say that that's very much due to your passion for this industry. You're not just here because, you see it as a paycheck, or sure, it's a nice stable career or anything like that. I mean, your passion comes through in what you do and how you lead and kind of how you're shaping the company. And so I just am curious, where does that passion for personal security and safety and preparedness, where does that all kind of come from?
As far as I can remember back into my childhood, frankly, I was the stereotypical type where I would grow up playing, cowboys or playing some sort of military type figure. I always had a passion actually growing up for the Green Berets for whatever reason. I never knew why, but I think it's probably the John Wayne movie that I forget what it's called now, but back in Vietnam. And so I just always had this passion for others from a perspective of helping them in their time of probably something that they might experience that could be their worst situation ever.
Right.
And my old man told me actually several months ago now, I never knew this, but he said when I was real little, 6 or 7, he said, one of the things you told me was, Dad, someday I'm going to grow up and I'm going to save people. And just kind of funny how that kind of played out naturally. I had all my eggs in the Air Force basket, frankly. I didn't intend to get out of the Air Force. That was kind of a heartbreak for me, actually. But I was also one of the oddballs that coming out of high school, I knew exactly what I wanted to do thematically for my life. And so I was fortunate to be able to do that for as long as I was able to in the service. And then into the private sector, I've been able to maintain the same vein.
So that's interesting that you said you have always wanted to help save people. But really how that's kind of transpired is you starting out as a SEER specialist or a survival instructor, as as layman's kind of say it.
Yeah.
And you teach individuals to kind of save themselves, right? And that's a true niche in this industry, because it's one thing to be able to build a policy or to preach about security, but it's another thing to really teach it and to empower the individual. So can you give us a little bit of insight into your time with SEER and kind of how that shaped that passion that we see today?
Yeah. How I made it through the gates, I have no idea. I think I was one of the types that squeaked through, but it's a really cool career field. It revolves entirely around, in the private sector, it kind of falls into two things. It's travel risk management, and it's also largely crisis management. But the interesting thing about it is the focus is so laser pointed onto the customer, the end using individual, whether they're a pilot, whether they're a ground team member, or other words, some type of high risk of isolation. That's what we call it in the military. Right. Some sort of individual that is at high risk of being held captive, being isolated from their unit, being isolated from their mission, and needing some sort of skill set to be able to get themselves back into friendly hands, or unlocking a recovery mechanism that can come in and get them, whatever the circumstance might be. But the skill set we would provide is we would teach these individuals on that entire spectrum, regardless of where they are globally. We would teach them how they can affect that end. If something happens to you, regardless of where you are around the world, here's the exact tasks, or here's the exact issues you need to take care of to survive. Maybe you're in a wartime environment, maybe you're not. And all of the things that come with that, we would teach them how to do. And then when we're overseas, one of the big parts that the career field does is what's known as personnel recovery. Some people might know that term, others might not, but that's the support side of this, where we're building in dedicated mechanisms. So when something does happen to one of our war fighters, one of our military members, or even sometimes other government organizations, if something happens to them, we have this whole system and mission set and capability in place to be able to get those individuals back into friendly hands. It's a unique commitment that we have in the United States over many other countries. Like, as an example, we're still looking for the remains of people that have died fighting for the country in Vietnam and World War II. If you think of the prisoner of war MIA flag, it's so representative of what we did. And the uniqueness of it is that end user, that individual, that if something happens to you, you have to own that process. You have to recognize that somebody might not come and get you. You can't necessarily call a number or get on a radio in the military context in many instances, but you have to recognize that it's incumbent upon you, the person in the circumstance, to recognize what you have to do and initiate a sequence of events to get back to wherever safety is for you.
So as we're talking about personal preparedness and transitioning your time from the military to the corporate or private sector, what are some parallels there where, there's some commonalities, but there's also some differences? Can you kind of speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. The one big difference that I've seen, I would say, is in the service and in the Department of Defense, there's dedicated resources, I guess is a better way to
Mm,
put it, to ensuring that people go through their training process and get the information or get the education that they need for the experiences that they might potentially have. As an example, before pilots can go and perform their mission set at a base level or overseas, they have to go through the training we would provide them before they're allowed to even do their job. It was a requirement built in.
right.
By contrast, in the private sector, sometimes training is more of a nice to have.
Yeah, true.
And that can be kind of a pitfall, in my opinion, because, the value of training in so many regards, regardless of whether it's a security issue or a personal safety and security issue or anything, training is pivotal to ensuring that things that are expected of people or things that we need to rely upon get done. It's training that oftentimes influences or informs how that is all going to occur. And so it's just that's a big contrast that I see, but the similarities are, people in the private sector, if we go all the way back to things as extreme as, say, 9/11 or all of these different active assailant situations that we've seen, different forms of extreme violence, even civilians can experience these kinds of things and have the same need. And if you look at a lot of things that are stressing out America, there's actually a great survey that's done by the American Psychological Association called Stress in America. And a couple of years ago, one of the things they found was that the potential of experiencing an active shooter was one of the most significant sources of stress for Americans. And so when we're looking at parallels and talking about experiencing a crisis and how to get through that, well, there's a lot of those kinds of similarities.
Yeah, and that's kind of, as you and I like travel all over and build this training and conduct this training, that's one of the greatest takeaways I've had, at least, in doing this mission, is you see everybody as they're feeling this pressure, right? They kind of feel powerless. And when you start creating this awareness and you start giving them some tools, as simple as it might seem, you kind of see that light bulb click and you see that aha moment when they're like, this is really useful. Like, this is really impactful. Like, I'm going to go home and talk to my kids about this.
Mm-hmm.
Or, we're talking about maybe like de-escalation, and people are like, this will actually help me in my personal relationships, like
Mm-hmm.
not just my work relationships, or not just in extreme, situations. And so you kind of see what we do where it's like, yeah, we're empowering people in the military to survive. But now you see that parallel in the private sector and you see that aha moment. And it's almost like, I don't want to say more fulfilling, but it's so gratifying when you just see the person really truly get it. And they're like, this is so useful. And pardon the expression, but it's like, I'm not just a sitting duck anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's like
Mm-hmm.
there are things I can actively be doing to better my situation, to impact my survivability.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's that moment that it's like, that is the mission,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. It's funny. I'm one of those bozos that when I've gotten in conflict with my wife because of,
Be careful.
putting my
Be
foot in
careful
my
what you
mouth
say.
or whatever I've done. Oh, she's the same. I am, but she now picks up on when I'm trying to actively de-escalate things and,
And it escalates.
it escalates it more. She's like, stop using those skills on me or whatever it is. But to your larger point, I had the opportunity to teach a company, employees for a company in Silicon Valley several years ago. I want to say it was circa 2017 timeframe. And they were concerned about some of the various issues their employees were experiencing in San Francisco when they're on the transit and or just kind of transiting back and forth from their office to their either car in the parking garage, whatever the situation might be. And I was talking to them about preventing violence, situational awareness concepts, pretty basic things, responding to, at the time, what we called active shooter, now largely call active assailant most of the time. And provided them the fundamentals, awareness training, And I got an email probably 3 months later, 4 months later from the primary contact that we were working with. And he sent me the information from one of their employees that ended up experiencing an armed robbery at a convenience store.
Oh, no kidding.
Several evenings afterward. And they shared their experience in there. And this was just awareness training, providing a presentation, walking
Basic
through
level.
some concepts, basic level, but they internalized it enough to where they were able to recognize that when the individual walked through the door, started, I don't know the situation, but started robbing the store, they recognized that obviously something wasn't going well. They looked for their options to get out of the situation and exited out the backside of the facility and told the security director for the company at the time and said, I credit this to that presentation that we received because it just gave me an initial framework to start thinking about these things and have an understanding of how I can start posturing myself for something like this ahead of time.
To be an active participant.
That's right. And so many of these things, like sometimes I think maybe there's a misnomer that these concepts that we talk about may seem like, for a lack of a better term, rocket science or something like that. But oftentimes it's just kind of providing a picture or a framework that individuals can then adopt and apply to their own day-to-day, and then begin using and exercising. And then, by the way, like you were sharing, taking it home to their family, having a conversation, talking about it with their school kids or talking about it with whoever else in their communities. And that builds resilience.
Yeah. Well, and oftentimes, we as we're building these training programs and we're developing instructors and all of this stuff, and the late Randy Spivey would always talk about this too, and now we talk about it, is there's a secret sauce here, right? Because it's, there's other people that do this. There's other people in the industry. But there's a difference between what they do and what we do.
Mm-hmm.
What would you attribute that difference to?
I think it's the ownership piece.
Yeah.
I think it's looking at things through the lens of the customer.
Right.
And this is something that, at least when I was active duty, as an example, they drilled into us tirelessly and put us through all of these different kinds of experiences so that we could better relate the principles that we were trying to communicate to the end user. And so what I mean by that is, let's say somebody is going to be operating in the Middle East or somebody's going to be operating in the jungle somewhere. They put us through all of these different experiences. So not only could we tell them, here's what you need to know, but by the way, here's exactly what it was like. And here's what you can expect to happen. And it's from their context. You're on this type of air platform. You're performing this kind of mission. We had to get familiar with all of that information. So it was almost like, when done well, granted,
right?
It was almost like you create this framework where you're talking about their experience externally. You're helping them identify what their experience is going to look like. And the focus is on them. You're helping them create that ownership in the process rather than perhaps me talking about my experience and talking about the parallels or having some disconnected framework or some disconnected principle or some disconnected application that they can't relate to.
Yeah.
It's that relatability and that ability to focus on, here's exactly how you're going to be using this information, and here's how you can apply it and tailor it and adapt it to your day-to-day so it makes it more user-friendly.
Applicable.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it's honestly like, we heard Dave Benson talking about this as well. Like, it's not fear-mongering.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so it's like we're taking a topic that, at least to our generation and above, what I've seen is it's almost taboo. Right. We almost have to have that disclaimer out there. But now our kids starting at, I don't even know what grade. I think my daughter was 4th or 5th grade when she first went through her first active assailant drill.
Mm-hmm.
Now these kids, I mean, it's a good thing and a bad thing, right? But they are becoming inoculated from, the stress of like talking about these tough subjects, right?
Yeah.
And so we can take something that is almost taboo and make it relatable and applicable to more ways than just if there's an active shooter in front of you, right?
Mm-hmm.
It applies to all kinds of situations that you might find yourself in, whether you're traveling downtown or you're traveling to a foreign country or you're just going about your day-to-day life, right? You're in a shopping mall, you're whatever. It's being able to sense when something's kind of off, and really that empowerment,
Mm-hmm.
right? To kind of giving yourself that mental permission slip that we hear us all talk about a
It's a
lot.
key phrase.
Right? That mental permission slip to really respond.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost like in the height of things, when it's fight, flight, or freeze, right? Your normal reaction is just to freeze.
Yeah.
But then, then your training kicks in. Then that muscle memory kicks in. And yes, it's great if you can actually practice this and rehearse it and drill it and all of this stuff. But to your point earlier about the convenience store, that was just a lecture, right? And it's just talking through these principles. And then they were able to, conceptualize that, and they were able to recall that muscle memory. And that's all it took.
Yep.
Right? When everybody else, you look around, everybody else is freezing, you're responding. You're believing what you hear and see, and you're getting out of there.
Yeah, you can't overemphasize the value of having a mental framework, and that's where we get that phrase, having that mental permission slip. It's that empowerment piece of you have the ability to do something to affect your own safety and security. And in many regards, it's incumbent upon you to recognize that, because even if you think about, let's take an active assailant situation, in a good scenario, it might take a couple minutes, maybe even several seconds until law enforcement arrives. But there's still a time frame there that you have to decide how you're going to impact your own safety and security.
Yeah.
And so having that framework, having that inoculation, and there's varying degrees of that. I love that you said that, because that's so much a part of expanding upon that framework. You get that awareness, you get some experience, you start working within these different things as you build some maturity or you get more practice. But I can remember when I was in high school, I was going through forestry training. And unbeknownst to us in the class, my instructor had epilepsy.
Oh.
And one of the days we're out in the woods and we're out pretty far into this location. He would, drive the bus, and he was like our provider wherever we were going. One day he hits the ground and he has a seizure. And we were a deer in the headlights. And he ended up coming to. There was actually a couple guys in my class that I remember that actually had a pretty strong wherewithal to, one guy kind of grabbed his tongue, another person kind of held him there, and it was kind of a freaky thing. But a lot of us were kind of looking at it like, what in the world is happening? I had never seen a seizure before. Add in some training, add in some years, add in some experience. Well, then you have this framework that you can recall and work on. I remember being in the service, and we were trained on same kind of thing when you're out in the wilderness of, if there's a medical issue, here's exactly the steps you can go through based upon the injury that occurs. We had a pilot one time that took a strong stick to the eye, and we had to actually go out and patch it all up and walk him out of the woods all the way, covering up both eyes. And there's a whole protocol that we would go through. But you follow that protocol because you have something to fall back on. There's no absence there.
Right.
And so you have that capability as an individual to rely and call that training back, call that information back, and be able to pursue a positive momentum forward.
That's definitely important in those situations, right? Because you don't want to be in those situations and then in hindsight, I wish I would have paid attention. I wish I would have had that training. I wish I would have, taken my personal preparedness seriously. So that's some good insight. And I kind of wanted to talk for a moment about, as organizations build programs, and you've worked with a lot of them, you have a lot of experience in this field. What would you say one of the biggest gaps are in, within an organization, and one way that organizations can work to kind of fill that gap?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I hate to keep beating on the drum of training, but that definitely tends to be one of them. And not only necessarily training for the individual, but it comes in layers, right? When we look at, let's just use the example of a violence prevention program. That's one of the things that we're known for at the center. There's so many different components to a program. You've got plans, policies, and procedures. You generate organizational awareness through training all of your people. There's a level of applicability that you need to have from managers and supervisors, those frontline leaders, and training them at a deeper level. Training a threat management team on behavioral threat assessment and management capabilities and techniques, and how that kind of really becomes the nucleus of this. And then there's even the leadership and their involvement in this and sewing all of this into the culture. Well, when we see these different issues, a lot of times, one of the biggest gaps we can see is companies will have a policy. They might have some basic procedures in place. They might train their people. When they're training their people, oftentimes you'll see that they just have like an active assailant type training program, and they miss this whole spectrum of prevention side of things, recognizing that we don't have to wait for bang. We can go left and have a whole suite of awareness for prevention to stop these things from occurring, what to look for, what to be aware of. And then the other piece is the leadership, that frontline leadership, recognizing that they're so positioned, they're right in the middle of this entire process, giving them a framework of where specifically and how specifically they fall into the prevention process, giving them a deeper indication of just how important it is to know their people. Because yes, it's important to recognize that people, if they have a change in behavior, sometimes that can be an indicator of concerning behavior. But if you don't know your people, you might not recognize when those changes occur. Or as a leader, if something does come to you and you get a report,
what do I do about it?
What do I do about it? And how do you not exacerbate a situation? Or so many different things that they can be such an effective cog in the wheel, if you will, because they're right in the middle. They bridge the gap between the threat management team, which is responsible for identifying, how severe a threat potentially might be, as an example, or what to do about it. We're telling all of our employees to report when they see certain things. What do they say? Who do they report it to? And then right there in the middle is that leadership team. And oftentimes that's one of the biggest gaps that we see, leadership and identifying how they fall within this whole spectrum. Because one of the things you mentioned, Dave, earlier, one of the things that he's always advocated for and told so many times is workplace violence prevention. It's an informational process.
Yeah.
You have to be able to create a mechanism to move the information to where it needs to go so all of this stuff can be properly addressed. And ultimately, a lot of times, it's an indication that somebody needs help. It's an indication that somebody's struggling and they need some sort of help. But if we're not getting that information, we might have a potential problem brewing underneath our very eyes.
Protect what you can't afford to lose with the Safe Workplace Suite by CPPS, the leading provider of workplace violence solutions. Empower your people, protect your brand, and align with standards. The Safe Workplace Suite includes everything your workplace violence program needs, like assessments, plans and policies, e-learning, instructor training, and behavioral threat support. CPPS is trusted by over half the Fortune 100 and endorsed by ASIS International. So visit safeworkplacesuite.com or check the show notes for more information. One thing I've noticed as I've been on the road doing a lot of manager and leadership training in this space is they are the ones that are thirstiest for this information. They are so hungry for this information. They're so appreciative for the information because it's like, yeah, what do I do about it? I mean, what if somebody hands me a protection order? What do I do about it? What if somebody brings up to me like, hey, I have, this person I'm concerned about. Well, how do I know? What am I supposed to do about it? Right. And so what advice would you have for those managers or leaders? What would you tell them to do about it? I mean, what do you do in that situation?
If they're starting from square one, I would say go to your leadership and start asking questions and start identifying that perhaps there is this gap within the organization. But secondly is recognize, it goes back to that ownership piece. Recognize that you are an initial leader within the organization and you have a strong impact to establish a culture that is focused on professionalism and respect. So many times, if you look at society as a whole, we're seeing a lot of people that are stressed out. People are on edge for various reasons, whatever that is. Well, as a frontline leader, you're kind of the initial person that's in this position to represent the brand and create a culture that creates openness and creates the ability for individuals to speak up about challenges that they have, or
Right.
creates a environment where these kinds of things can become known,
Where it's safe to do so.
where it's safe to do so. And so while you might have just the same awareness level of training as a leader that everybody else does, take that initial step and take the initial time to get to know your people and recognize how are they actually doing. Not just maybe asking, hey, how are you doing? Great. Okay, cool. Good seeing you.
I'm good today.
Take that time and sow that relationship, build that relationship, because when you start recognizing these things, one, it's going to create a better work environment.
Sure.
But secondly, it also has the effect of applying to all of these things we're discussing now.
Well, and when these situations become extreme and workplace violence does occur, right? And there's always some kind of investigation, and it's almost always traced back to some kind of grievance. And then from there was this pathway, right? This recognizable signs and all of this along the way. But it's like the managers and leaders are the ones that can recognize when there is that grievance and when something is off and resolve it before it leads to this pathway, right? And so that's another reason I think why they're kind of key in that path. But
that's the de-escalation piece, right?
Right.
As an example,
That's
you know,
exactly where I
as
was
one
going.
capability
Yeah.
within this whole process,
Yeah.
having the ability to identify when somebody's struggling and not exacerbate it, not create more problems, but look at things through the eyes of empathy, listen to what they have to say, and not just hearing what they have to say so that you can respond back, but really listening to what's going on, identifying, you know, what's happening in their world, and then being able to sometimes as simply as articulate their experience back to them, so they have that understanding that, he hears me, I feel understood. You know, people so desperately oftentimes want to feel heard and understood.
And that's what it almost always comes down to, right? And active listening is easier said than done, is what I've learned. You're definitely better at it than I am in that situation. You've practiced it. You do a much better job. But one thing I learned the hard way is, you know, in between my time being active duty and then contracting with the Air Force, I spent 4 years as a manager in a grocery store in LA as the closing manager.
And you survived.
And I survived, right? And one thing I realized, though, if I could go back and tell myself then what I know now, you know, when you're dealing with the public on a day-to-day basis, right? You become very calloused and you become like, you know, oh, it's just Monday. Like, yeah, we get yelled at. That's what we do here, right? And so when a new person would start and now I'm the one in charge, and you know, a customer would scream at them and yell at them and go off, maybe throw things. I mean, it really gets a little volatile at times. And you know, I'd look at them and I'd be like, you want to work here? You better grow a thick skin, you know? And I'm like, oh no, that's like the wrong thing to say. But we get so used to our environment. And as we teach this de-escalation, whether it's with someone that deals with the public or it's healthcare that also deals with the public, right? I mean, they're in that high risk industry. They get so used to being and accustomed to being in that volatile space that they're like, this is just part of the job. What would you say to those people that think like, it's Monday, I get spit on Mondays. That's just what I do here, right? What would you say to those individuals?
Well, you said it yourself, actually, and it's recognizing that it's not part of the job.
Right.
Because you signed up to be, say, a healthcare provider, or you're in a customer service industry. One part is the company has to set the stage, the organization has to set the stage that kind of behavior is not going to be tolerated and that is not going to be accepted. And they have that commitment to their own employees and their own staff for, you know, we're going to look after our own people. But secondly, it is recognizing that that isn't part of the job. When you signed up to be, say, a nurse, you didn't sign up to be bitten or spit on or pushed or shoved.
Actually, the opposite of that.
It's actually the opposite of that. And so when those kinds of things come up, it's all part of this program. It's creating awareness. It's having that policy and procedure that sets the stage for these kinds of things are not going to be allowed within our organization, and making sure that if it's patients or customers or whoever is coming in, they have an understanding of that. But also that commitment and following up from an organizational perspective that if these things do occur, there is a process that's going to be followed and it's going to be handled, and that there's going to be that commitment shown to the individual that we're going to follow through on your safety and security, and that's not okay. And we're going to make sure that we have mechanisms in place to be able to deal with these things. Are you going to stop every incident? No, probably not. But you can have something in place that creates an environment where a lot of these different things can be addressed. And then from the individual perspective, recognizing that when these things do get, when these things do arise, rather, that you have to provide that information, have the capabilities, think ahead of time of how you might respond to the situation, but then provide it within the larger framework so that it can be properly dealt with. Don't just accept that it's happening to you,
Right.
and then, for example, not report that information.
Yeah, right. And then it almost becomes part of your culture that this is not okay. This is not tolerated. And especially for those that deal with the public, it's like we also have to condition the public to believe that this is not okay. You cannot walk into somebody's workplace and treat them however you want because they work in a public entity, right? Or because they work in healthcare, or because that's not okay. And so there's some conditioning that has to happen there. And that's by having those good policies and procedures in place. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like, and not to get too philosophic here, it's going to sound probably that way, though,
now.
I'm sure.
Okay,
yeah,
let's go.
It just seems like there's a lack of, lately, given everything that's happened in our society over the past several years, that there's a lack of the respect for the sanctity of your neighbor.
Right. Yeah.
And maybe that it has been social media, or I don't know what it has been, but recognizing that that's kind of the field that we're playing in. And so because of that, how much more does it require being able to employ skills such as active listening or the ability to empathize with another? Because again, those kinds of things can allow the individual in a circumstance that might be escalating, or, whatever it is.
Yeah.
It gives a framework to be able to work through the problem and get on the other side better off than what you might otherwise.
Well, yeah. And to the point I made earlier, you're getting down to that grievance, you're resolving it instead of just putting a Band-Aid on it, and then it's going to sit there and kind of fester again, right? And not saying that everybody with a grievance acts out and commits extreme events. However, it's still not nice for the work environment, right? When people are kind of acting out or feeling a certain type of way, like we've all worked with those people, and it's not a fun place to be. So it's creating that culture for sure. And I think it's important, you and I have talked a lot about this as we talk about de-escalation. We hear a lot like, okay, I'm having this conversation with people, I'm practicing these principles that you've showed me, and now it's just not working. Like now, they're still being very abusive. They're closing the distance. What are my options then? Do I sit there and still have these conversations with people? Am I still being empathetic? Am I still actively listening? Am I still trying to build rapport? All of these things. Or what do I do from there? What does that look like?
Yeah, well, it's definitely an indicator that there's other issues going on, because, it could be several different things, right? If it's based upon the individual circumstance, perhaps the individual kind of has to go back and do a follow-on review of how the situation went the way that it did. Is there anything that we as an individual can do better about it? Is there something that needs to be changed within the program in terms of how protocols are established to address the situation? Maybe protocol was followed to the T, and the way the protocol is written or the way the protocol is to be followed sets people up for failure. What it could be a myriad of different things. For it's hard to say with a blanket answer, but at a minimum, I would say it should give pause to look back and be like, why isn't this effective? Why isn't this going the way that we think it should be going? And try to address where that source is. Is it happening to other people? Is it just happening to me?
Yeah.
Is this a systemic issue? And kind of, for a lack of a better term, circle the wagons and figure out what's going on.
Or like, where is that line, right? Where is that line where I'm no longer tolerating this behavior? This is not working. And I'm now going to remove myself from this situation, right? And I'm going to disengage. Everybody's line is different. Right. In training, we show these videos and it'll be this volatile situation. And it's like, okay, everybody right now, like yell out, now when this is where you would disengage. This is where you would, exercise your response options. And what's so interesting is you hear now being uttered in so many different variances of this video playing where things are escalating and then eventually a weapon gets, brandished and things of that sort. But it's so interesting because a lot of that depends on your own personal life experiences, right?
Yeah.
And so it's about having that talk with yourself, asking yourself those what if questions ahead of time before you get into that situation. So having a little bit of that hindsight, right?
Yeah, the difference between knowing when is there an opportunity to de-escalate and cool off the situation,
Right.
or do you have to disengage?
Yeah.
It is a gray area. It's a big gray area, because what your tolerance might be for a
That's right.
situation might be different than mine, or
Yeah.
whoever else. And so I think perhaps one of the bigger things that individuals could probably do is identify for themselves what that line is, right? Because if you think about it ahead of time, hopefully you won't be surprised when it actually happens. But when you start seeing these signs, is somebody getting inside of your bubble?
Right.
We like our bubbles here in the States. We got nice big,
That's right.
Personal spaces. And so if somebody is getting within that, what does that mean to you? Or what are you going to do about it? And so thinking about that spectrum, and like you're saying, if people have experiences, usually it seems like people often kind of get an increased comfortability with handling or experiencing that kind of situation in the future. But the caveat to that is we also can't be complacent.
That's right.
As we experience these different things too, because no situation is going to be the same. And so having those different schemes or frameworks that we can recall and thinking about this stuff ahead of time is going to get so much ground, in a positive manner that hopefully it kind of facilitates that process in a positive way.
Yeah. So to that point about thinking about things ahead of time, you have a lot of experience in this space. And as COO, where do you see the future of this industry going? Personal security, personal protection. Where do you see all of the corporate security? Where do you see all of this kind of trending?
Since the pandemic, it seems like this is kind of taken off more and more, I would say. But slowly, I would say that at least the private sector has been kind of inching in this direction. And for us at CPPS, we focus on the safety and security of people and building frameworks and programs around that. And so within that, I would say it's largely becoming, and some organizations have kind of gotten there already, but that is the safety and security of the individual, regardless of where they're working.
Yeah.
So if you think about the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, where was everybody working? At home, largely.
That's right.
Unless they were identified as an essential worker, then they're still, out working. But you have now the home environment as being kind of pivotal to operations still today. Travel has resurged, and that is a big component of where individuals can work. We've worked with some companies where they actually have the capability for their employees to go and work remotely or work in other parts of the world just as part of their regular duties. It's not necessarily just a travel and out and back. It's you can go and work for several months in these locations. So you have that. And then of course you also have the aspect of the traditional office space and these different issues that come along with that. So there's this huge myriad or huge spectrum of work environments. That's what we like to call it at the center, is the work environment. And even if we talk about just exclusively the context of violence and violence prevention, well, that can happen in all of these different locations. You can be a victim of potential violence at a Starbucks the same way you could at your own home, or the same way you could at the office.
Right.
And so having these programs built in a manner that addresses that full spectrum, the safety and security of the individual, regardless of where they are, I think is where these things are going to be leading to. And what that's called down the road, I think is still to be seen. But whether it's guys under an insider threat program, say, or whatever it is, these kinds of things are kind of blending together to where anywhere that person is working, we're going to have an effective plans, policies, and procedures, adequate training to address that entire spectrum to ensure that people are adequately taken care of and they know exactly how to act on behalf of the organization.
So that's a good point, and something I'd like to kind of talk about and pick your brain about a little bit is, you know, we deal a lot with corporations, right? And building policies and comprehensive workplace violence programs and training and all of that sort. But yet our mission is empowering the individual. Why is that? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, because the individual, it goes back to the individual is so impactful in this entire process. You can have all of the support frameworks in the world. You can have the best program, but if you don't have the requisite buy-in and the requisite participation by the individual, it's not going to get you very far. At the end of the day, an organization is a whole myriad of individuals coming together to achieve objectives or advance a business or whatever that might be, but it's a bunch of individuals.
Right.
And so recognizing what place the individual has in that process and giving them that empowerment from the safety and security perspective, giving them that capability to recognize that you can largely impact how these things go based upon your ability to know what to do, how to progress through a situation, how to progress through a crisis. It is incumbent upon you. You can't outsource these different things. In other words, you have to have the ability to recognize what your options are.
Yeah.
And so having that ownership in the process and recognizing that you are a stakeholder in this process, you do have that capability to do something about this is in so many ways the basis of this. And that's that 2-degree shift. It's like a 2-degree shift in focus for like a 358-degree impact.
Yeah.
Of recognizing that it's the individual that this is all revolving around. It's for the individual. We build violence prevention programs for the safety and security of the individual. So it's incumbent upon us as professionals trying to help meet that end to really involve them in that process and help them be a stakeholder in that.
Yeah.
Because that's what it's all for.
Well, and you know what I really love about the mission here is it's, as we talk about empowerment, right? It's like we just talking in our daily lives, just interacting with people in your community, right? People are kind of feeling scared. And to your point about, the American Psychological Association, they have this report out and they confirm that, people are feeling their stress levels rise regardless of what the stats say, right? People feel a certain type of way. And so what do we do about it? I mean, that's really what it's about, right? It's not just an individual problem. It's not just an organizational problem. It's not just a community problem, a society problem. It's a worldwide problem, right? And as we travel the world and we talk about these things, we hear all the time, active shooters are an American problem. Like it's a United States problem. It's like, until you're dealing with an organization in China and they talk about, we don't have active shooters here. We don't need this training. But what do we do when we have somebody come in with a bladed instrument? It's like, that's an active assailant, right? And then you go to Australia. They're like, we don't have any kind of violence. We don't have that here. But some of our employees are really concerned about intimate partner violence. And this is now on the rise because we just sent everybody home and now they're all working from home and we have high rates of intimate partner violence. It's different for everybody and it looks different for everybody, but the response strategies and the empowerment remains the same, right? And so now people are taking back some of that control and they're feeling like, I don't have to just sit by. I can now be this active participant in my own safety and security and the safety and security of my family, my community, the society amongst us. Is like we're being participants in the solution instead of just, and what Dave Benson mentioned about being, bystanders versus upstanders. It's we're now being, taking our ownership, right? And putting it on us. What can I do? We can't control everybody, right? But what can I do? What can I do for my family and my community and things of that sort? So that's what I love about it. And you just see that light bulb moment click on and it's like, they get it. They get it, right? They're going to take this home. They're going to share this information. Like it's so impactful. So
where there's a lack of understanding, there can be the presence of, in this context, where you don't understand, there can be fear.
Point. Yeah.
There can be there's no mental concept there to be able to identify how do I go through something like this? And so because of that, the natural response in our bodies is our stress goes up. And for similar reasons, when you mentioned a while ago that kind of fight or flight response,
Right.
it's actually pretty common for even people that have had training to have still kind of some sort of freeze and what disbelief or what's going on, but they have that framework to start recalling upon as they start going through the circumstance. And so what we're providing is understanding. It's that understanding that you do have options.
Mm-hmm.
There are things you can do.
Right.
You don't just have to sit there and wait, or you don't just have to stand idly by. You can be your own advocate. That's okay.
Right. Yeah.
And there are things that you can do, and they can mean a lot in terms of your safety and security.
Yeah. Well, good point. And I think that's a good place for us to kind of wrap this up. So as we do that, what do you want those in this industry, the security professionals, protection professionals, or just people in general, society in general, what do you want them to walk away from this understanding most?
Well, I'd say focus on the customer, right? It's what we do and what we exist for is in so many ways for others, for the safety and security of others, and maintaining that perspective, I think is really, or at least can be really impactful to, building a program like this, like thinking through that lens or having that mindset, I think can really really change things.
Mm-hmm.
And so looking through that little bit of a different lens of what does the end user really need? What can I do for that end user to make their day-to-day better, reduce their stress, allow them to have that mental framework that we've been talking about, have that empowerment that is so important, because that's, I believe, so much of what we exist to do.
That's right.
That's what we're here for.
Well, that's great. I very much appreciate this conversation. Cheers.
Thank you, Stace.
Thanks.
Good seeing you, my friend.
You too. Thank you.